What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected tough guys walks into a daytime talk show ambush, armed with nothing but cold, hard logic, and refuses to back down? What unfolds when a legendary actor who has spent decades playing heroes decides he's had enough of being lectured by hosts who live in gated communities about why ordinary Americans shouldn't have the right to defend themselves? You're about to witness one of the most powerful, uncompromising, and absolutely devastating defenses of constitutional rights ever delivered on live television. A moment so intense that it left the hosts of The View speechless, scrambling, and completely unable to counter the systematic dismantling of their anti-gun talking points. This wasn't just another celebrity interview gone sideways. This wasn't a polite disagreement over policy details. What you're about to read is the story of how Kurt Russell, a man who built his career playing American heroes and who understands the difference between fantasy and reality better than anyone, walked into what he recognized as an ambush and proceeded to defend the Second Amendment with such clarity, such conviction, and such devastating logic that the hosts could do nothing but stammer weak responses and try desperately to change the subject. The studio audience sat in uncomfortable silence as Russell methodically dismantled every anti-gun argument thrown at him. Whoopi Goldberg, usually so commanding at that table, found herself outmatched by someone who actually understood both history and human nature. Joy Behar, never shy about her political opinions, discovered that spouting talking points is very different from defending them against someone who thinks for himself. And by the end of this confrontation, it was crystal clear who had won this battle of ideas. Little did the host know that their standard playbook of emotional manipulation and virtue signaling would crumble against a man who had spent his entire life in an industry built on fantasy while maintaining a firm grip on reality. What they thought would be an easy opportunity to get a celebrity to echo their gun control orthodoxy would become a masterclass in how to defend fundamental American rights with intelligence, conviction, and absolutely no apology. The warning signs were everywhere. Anyone who knew Kurt Russell's background, anyone familiar with his philosophy about keeping politics separate from entertainment, anyone who had paid attention to his public statements should have known this was going to end badly for The View. But they proceeded anyway, convinced that they could trap him, corner him, make him conform. They were about to learn that you don't trap a man who sees the cage before you close it. The setup. Walking into the lion's den, the morning started like countless others at The View. The set was perfectly lit. The audience settled into their seats, expecting their daily dose of celebrity interviews mixed with political commentary. The hosts sat at their familiar table, comfortable in their New York City bubble, confident in their worldview, ready to welcome their next guest. Behind the scenes, producers reviewed their notes, probably congratulating themselves on booking Kurt Russell, a genuine Hollywood legend who could draw viewers. Then Kurt Russell walked onto that set, and something was different about his energy. He carried himself with the same easy confidence he'd displayed in dozens of action movies. But there was something else there, too. A weariness, perhaps, or a readiness. This was a man who knew exactly what kind of environment he was entering. He'd been around long enough to recognize an ambush when he saw one being prepared. He settled into the guest chair with the relaxed posture of someone who had nothing to hide and nothing to prove. At this stage of his career, after decades of success, after becoming one of the most respected actors in Hollywood, he didn't need to play games or pander to anyone's expectations. He was there to promote his movie, and he was perfectly aware that they might try to drag him into political territory where they thought they had the advantage. The opening pleasantries were brief and professional. There was warmth in the greetings, smiles all around, the kind of surface-level friendliness that characterizes celebrity interviews, but anyone paying close attention could sense the undercurrent. The hosts exchanged glances that suggested they had an agenda beyond just discussing Russell's latest film project. They were waiting for their moment, loading up their talking points, preparing to deploy what they surely thought were devastating arguments. Kurt Russell sat there calmly answering their questions about the movie with the professionalism of someone who had done thousands of these interviews. But those who knew him well, those familiar with his philosophy about entertainment and politics, might have noticed something in his expression. A slight edge of anticipation, perhaps, or recognition. He knew what was coming. He'd been through this before. Walked into situations where entertainment journalists suddenly transformed into political activists, where a movie promotion turned into an interrogation about his beliefs. The trap was being set, though it wasn't particularly subtle. The hosts were building up to something. You could feel it in how they structured their questions, in the loaded language they used, in the way they kept circling around certain topics. They thought they had an easy target, a Hollywood actor who they assumed would either agree with their anti-gun position or would fumble when challenged on it. They had no idea that they were about to face someone who had thought deeply about these issues, who understood history and human nature, and who absolutely refused to be intimidated by consensus or social pressure. What the View hosts failed to understand, what they would learn in the most uncomfortable way possible, was that Kurt Russell wasn't just another celebrity looking for approval. He was a man with deeply held principles. Someone who understood the difference between the fantasy violence of movies and the real-world necessity of self-defense. Someone who had studied the Constitution and American history. And someone who was completely unafraid to stand alone against a table full of people who disagreed with him. The shift happened suddenly like a switch being flipped. One moment they were discussing his film career. The next moment, Whoopi Goldberg was bringing up gun control, framing it in the context of terrorism, clearly expecting Russell to either agree with her perspective or stumble trying to defend his position. "You made some headlines for saying that gun control laws wouldn't deter terrorists," Whoopi said, her tone suggesting that this was somehow a controversial or problematic statement. "Explain to folks what you meant by that." The air in the studio shifted immediately. This was no longer a friendly celebrity interview. This was an ambush, and everyone in that studio recognized it for what it was. The other hosts leaned forward slightly, ready to pile on once Russell gave them an opening. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing conflict ahead. The cameras zoomed in closer. The producers in the control room probably excited that they were about to get some viral content. But Kurt Russell didn't flinch. He didn't stammer or backtrack or try to soften his position. Instead, he called out exactly what was happening. "Well, first of all, I was in a situation where we do what we call the dog and pony. We're out doing the dog and pony show on a picture, and sometimes you get what you feel is slightly ambushed by somebody who's really got an agenda," Russell said, his voice steady and measured. "And I think that's my opinion of what happened to me the other day." Right there in those opening words, he established the frame. He wasn't going to pretend this was neutral journalism. He wasn't going to play along with the fiction, that they were just curious about his views. He was calling it what it was, an ambush by people with a predetermined agenda, and he was letting everyone know that he saw through it. The hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't how celebrities usually responded. Most would get defensive, try to walk back their statements, apologize for causing offense. Russell was doing the opposite. He was doubling down and calling them out. "The last thing I like to watch is entertainers or actors get political," he continued. And you could hear the conviction in his voice. "It's just something I can't stand watching." So, having said that, no, I was kind of asked to put it in context somehow with this movie. There was something powerful about this approach. He was establishing a principle that entertainers should entertain, not preach, while simultaneously making it clear that he'd been dragged into this conversation against his better judgment. He was setting up the context that he didn't want to be political, but since they insisted on ambushing him with political questions, he was going to answer honestly. "My personal feeling is that there's a big difference between fantasy land and reality," Russell explained, his voice taking on a teacher-like quality, as if explaining something obvious to children who should already understand it. "Fantasy land is what we do. You're either writing something, writing a song, writing a book, doing a movie, doing a television show. That's fantasy land, and that's where that stuff belongs." The logic was irrefutable, but you could see the hosts already preparing their counterarguments, already loading up their emotional appeals and their scripted talking points. They weren't listening to understand, they were waiting for their turn to attack. In reality, when we're dealing with things like terrorism, we're all going to have different opinions on how to deal with it, Russell continued, his calm demeanor standing in stark contrast to the growing tension at the table. "Mine happens to be that I think there's a very strong reason the Founding Fathers had for the Second Amendment, and that is that no government ever hasn't had to fight its own people, and its own people hasn't had to fight its own government." The statement hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down on the table. Russell had just invoked the actual purpose of the Second Amendment. Not hunting, not sport shooting, but the fundamental right of people to defend themselves against tyrannical government. This was the argument that gun control advocates most desperately want to avoid because it exposes the real stakes of the debate. Whoopi shifted in her seat, clearly not expecting such a direct and historically grounded argument. The other hosts looked uncertain, as if trying to figure out how to respond to something that contradicted everything they believed, but was grounded in historical fact. We had our Civil War, Russell continued, his voice gaining strength. If that Second Amendment hadn't been there, those people would not have had the opportunity to do what they considered was defending their life, their way, their style of living. So I agree with that. I think that's an important part of our existence. And it's basically that simple. The simplicity of the argument was its power. Russell wasn't hiding behind complicated language or trying to parse words carefully to avoid offense. He was stating plainly what the Second Amendment was for, what it had been used for, and why it remained necessary. It was the kind of clarity that makes people uncomfortable precisely because it's so hard to argue against without revealing your own authoritarian impulses. I think people more object to the excesses of the Second Amendment, not the Second Amendment itself, Russell added, showing that he understood the other side's position even as he rejected it. It's the excesses, and that's where the debate comes in. I think it's too bad that the debate can't remain kind of civil, too. There was a warning in that last comment, a suggestion that he knew this conversation was about to become Univille, that he knew they were preparing to attack rather than discuss. He was giving them notice that he saw what was coming and was ready for it. And that's hard to do, he continued, his voice taking on a more somber tone. Sometimes talking about terrorism, whatever we do, and we all have our opinion on that too. Whatever we do, we're a little late for people who died. And if you know somebody or you know a child that was maimed in that situation, I got a strong feeling that one's opinion has a tendency to change. This was Russell at his most effective, acknowledging the emotional weight of the issue while refusing to let emotion override logic. He was saying essentially that feelings are real and valid, but they don't change the fundamental constitutional principles at stake. It was a masterful rhetorical move, showing empathy while maintaining his position. But the hosts weren't interested in nuance or understanding. They were preparing their counterattack, loading up the emotional manipulation and hypothetical scenarios that they thought would force Russell to concede their point. One of the hosts decided to try a different angle, bringing up the feeling in America after terrorist attacks, the anxiety, the fear. It was a transparent attempt to use emotion to override Russell's logical arguments to suggest that people's fears justified restricting constitutional rights. Russell saw through it immediately. I don't understand the concept of this conversation about gun culture, he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine confusion at the absurdity of the premise. We've lived with guns since what, the 7th century or something? I don't know. Then one of the hosts made a catastrophic mistake. In an attempt to psychoanalyze gun owners and dismiss their concerns, she said something that revealed the profound condescension and class snobbery underlying the gun control movement. Right now, guns is a totem. It's a metaphor that disenfranchised white guys need, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. It makes them feel good. The mask had slipped. The real agenda was exposed. This wasn't about safety or terrorism or protecting children. This was about looking down on ordinary Americans, dismissing their concerns, psychoanalyzing their motivations instead of addressing their arguments. It was the kind of elite condescension that drives millions of Americans crazy. The idea that urban liberals in New York City know better than everyone else what's good for them. Russell's response would be devastating. But first, let's appreciate the absurdity of what had just been said. The idea that the Second Amendment exists because disenfranchised white guys need it is so historically illiterate, so condescending, so revealing of class prejudice that it's almost hard to believe someone said it on national television. It ignores the Founding Fathers' explicit reasoning, ignores the historical context of government tyranny, ignores the practical reality of self-defense, and reduces a constitutional right to a psychological crutch. But Russell didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply proceeded to methodically destroy the argument with calm, cold logic. If you think gun control or something like that is going to change a terrorist's point of view, I think you're out of your mind, Russell said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. I think anybody is. I think it's absolutely insane. Notice the progression there. He started with I think you're out of your mind, then corrected to anybody who believes that, then drove it home with absolutely insane. He was making it clear that this wasn't a reasonable position to hold, that it defied basic logic and common sense. The problem we're having right now is that we don't have the concepts of how to turn it around and say, you may think you've got me worried about what you're going to do, dude. You're about to find out what I'm going to do, and that's going to worry you a lot more, Russell continued. his voice taking on the edge of the tough guy characters he'd played for decades. And that's what we need. That will change the concept of gun culture, as you call it, to something of reality. He was articulating something profound here. The idea that deterrence works, that strength prevents violence, that making potential victims dangerous makes potential attackers think twice. It's a concept as old as human civilization, but one that modern gun control advocates desperately want to deny because it undermines their entire worldview. If I'm a hockey team and I got a guy bearing down on me as a goaltender, I'm not concerned about what he's going to do, Russell said, using a sports metaphor that made his point crystal clear. I'm going to make him concerned about what I'm going to do. The metaphor was perfect, accessible, understandable, impossible to misinterpret. He was talking about agency, about refusing to be a passive victim, about taking responsibility for your own defense instead of relying entirely on others to protect you. But the hosts weren't giving up. One of them tried to shift to the no-fly list argument, suggesting that people on terror watch lists shouldn't be able to buy guns. It seemed like a slam-dunk argument on the surface who could defend terrorists getting guns. Russell's response cut through the false premise like a knife through butter. They can also make a bomb pretty easily, he said, his tone making clear how obvious this was. So what? They can also get knives and stab you. What are you going to do about that? They can get cars and run you over with them. What are you going to do about that? The logic was inescapable. If you're dealing with people determined to commit murder, they'll find a way to do it whether guns are available or not. The 9 over 11 terrorists used box cutters and airplanes. The Boston Marathon bombers used pressure cookers. Terrorists in Europe have used trucks to mow down crowds. Evil finds a way, and focusing on the tool rather than the intent is missing the entire point. What are you going to do? Russell pressed, his voice gaining intensity. Outlaw everything? That ain't the answer. One of the hosts tried to salvage the argument. Just put some controls. But Russell was having none of it. What controls? He shot back. So the people who want to defend themselves can't. This was the heart of the matter. Every gun control measure, no matter how it's packaged or sold, ultimately restricts the ability of law-abiding citizens to defend themselves while doing nothing to stop criminals who by definition don't follow laws. Russell was forcing them to confront this reality that they desperately wanted to avoid, just so the idiots can't get a hold of them. The host tried again, retreating to the standard talking point. Russell's response was withering. Do you really believe they're not going to? Are you serious about that? Are you seriously? The disbelief in his voice was palpable. He was forcing them to confront the absurdity of their own position. The idea that criminals who by definition break laws would somehow be stopped by laws making it illegal for them to have guns. It's a fantasy, a delusion that only survives by refusing to think through its implications. And you think that you can control the behavior of people that are dead set on taking your way of life away from you? Russell continued, his voice rising slightly with the passion of someone who genuinely cannot understand how people could be so naive. You think you can control that? The question hung in the air, unanswered, because there was no good answer. You can't control terrorists or criminals through gun laws. You can only disarm their potential victims and make them more vulnerable. There's only one thing you can do with that and say, no, dude. That's not going to happen. That's just not going to happen, Russell said. And you could hear decades of playing tough guy heroes informing his delivery. This was a man who understood that sometimes the only way to stop violence is to be prepared to meet it with greater force. The interview continued with the hosts desperately trying different angles, different emotional appeals, different hypothetical scenarios. But Russell had established the framework so clearly, had articulated the fundamental principles so effectively that every subsequent argument they tried just highlighted their own confusion and inconsistency. At one point, Joy Behar made one of the most absurd statements ever uttered on the show, claiming she felt safer in the New York City subway system, one of the most dangerous places in America, than she would in Arizona, where law-abiding citizens carry guns. The statement was so divorced from reality, so revealing of her bubble-dwelling ignorance that it almost didn't require a response. The New York subway system, where people are regularly assaulted, pushed onto tracks, and worse, was supposedly safer than Arizona, where armed citizens go about their business without incident. Russell could have demolished this argument, could have cited statistics showing that states with shall issue concealed carry laws have lower violent crime rates, could have pointed out that the people she should fear are the criminals who already have guns in New York despite the strict laws. not law-abiding citizens who jump through every legal hoop to carry responsibly. But by this point, the absurdity spoke for itself. Whoopi tried another angle, suggesting that when everybody's got a gun, the police wouldn't know who the bad guys were. It was another argument that collapsed under its own weight. As if police can't tell the difference between someone actively shooting people and someone defending against an active shooter. As if the presence of armed citizens somehow makes law enforcement's job harder, rather than potentially saving lives before police can arrive. Russell's patience was beginning to wear thin. You could hear it in his voice, see it in his body language. He had come on this show to promote a movie, had been ambushed with political questions, had patiently explained basic logic and constitutional principles, and was now listening to arguments so weak they wouldn't survive a high school debate class. As the interview wound down, one of the hosts made a last desperate attempt to reframe the Second Amendment itself, suggesting it was only about militias, only about collective defense, not individual rights. It was the last refuge of gun control advocates trying to reinterpret the Constitution itself to mean something other than what it plainly says. But before Russell could fully respond to this, they cut to commercial. The hosts knew they were losing badly. They knew that every argument they tried was being systematically dismantled. They knew that the audience was seeing exactly how weak their position was when challenged by someone who actually understood both history and human nature. When they came back from the break, Russell made his position absolutely clear one final time. Is that the last time you're going to talk politics as an actor? Till I'm asked to, Russell replied with a slight smile. I'll be asked in an hour and a half about it. Once they trot that out, they're not going to let it go. There was resignation in his voice, but also conviction. He knew the media would continue trying to drag him into political debates, would continue trying to force him to either toe the line or be vilified. But he also knew he couldn't and wouldn't back down from defending fundamental rights, just because it made him unpopular in Hollywood circles. But you know what? One of the hosts said, trying to end on a friendly note. Trying to pretend the confrontation hadn't been as devastating as it was. If we have to be in it with somebody, I'm glad we're in it with you. It was damage control, an attempt to maintain some semblance of civility after getting thoroughly outmatched. But the damage was done. Anyone watching could see exactly what had happened. A principled man had walked into an ambush, had recognized it for what it was, had refused to back down, and had systematically destroyed every argument thrown at him using nothing but logic, historical understanding, and common sense. Russell had done what the hosts thought was impossible. He had defended the Second Amendment on their turf, in their house, against their prepared talking points and emotional appeals, and he had won decisively, not through volume or aggression, but through clarity and conviction. But the story doesn't end there, because what Kurt Russell started on The View, other voices continued and amplified. The conversation he sparked revealed truths about the Second Amendment that the mainstream media desperately wanted to keep suppressed. Ted Nent, the legendary musician and Second Amendment advocate, took Russell's arguments even further in later discussions. Where Russell had been measured and philosophical, Nent was passionate and uncompromising, articulating what millions of Americans believe, but are afraid to say in polite company. I believe that a person's moral compass can be determined by how he references free men's right to defend themselves, Nent declared, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The Second Amendment is so obvious to me. It's insane that there's an argument. This was the perspective Russell had hinted at, but hadn't fully articulated the idea that opposition to the Second Amendment reveals something fundamental about a person's view of human liberty and dignity. Do you trust free people to be armed and responsible? Or do you want a paternal government to protect them and control them? Nent went even further, stripping away all the historical and political context to get at the fundamental moral question. Let's pretend there is no document. Let's pretend brave families didn't leave the tyrants and slave drivers of Europe, so that they could practice the religion of their choice, so that they could speak out without being murdered, so that they could produce wool without the king's men coming and taking it from them every season of harvest. Let's pretend none of that happened, he continued, building his argument from first principles. Let's just pretend this guy named Ted Nent parachuted onto Earth and woke up one morning and saw these wonderful resources and had dreams of excellence in being the best that I could be. I don't need a document, and I don't need another man to explain to me that I have the right to defend my gift of life. This was the argument that gun control advocates cannot counter the natural right to self-defense that exists independent of any government grant, any constitutional provision, any legislative permission. The Second Amendment doesn't give Americans the right to bear arms. It recognizes and protects a pre-existing natural right that no government legitimately has the power to take away. And that there is an argument in America from Hillary Clinton, from Barbara Boxer, Dianne Feinstein, from a whole gaggle of numbnuts who would try to tell me they will dictate where, how, and if I can defend myself, Net continued, his voice rising with righteous anger. I find that preposterous. I find it unacceptable, and I will not accept it. I am a free man. Don't tread on me. This was the logical conclusion of Russell's more measured arguments, the absolute refusal to submit to government control over the most fundamental human right of self-preservation. It was the spirit of 1776 of the Revolution of the Founding brought into the 21st century and applied to modern debates. A good law-abiding citizen, not convicted of a felony. Net declared, "The Second Amendment of our Bill of Rights is my concealed weapons permit." Period. This statement encapsulated everything the gun control movement hates. The idea that the Constitution itself, not government permission slips and bureaucratic processes, guarantees the right to bear arms. The idea that shall not be infringed means exactly what it says. But beyond the constitutional and philosophical arguments, both Russell and Nent understood something that urban elites often miss: the real-world consequences of disarming law-abiding citizens while criminals remain armed. Nent put it in the starkest possible terms, using real examples that expose the deadly consequences of gun control ideology. The limitation should be, instead of arresting people for molesting children 24 times, I would rather the dad walked into the room, found a person molesting that child, and blew his brains out. It was a brutal image, deliberately provocative. But it made an undeniable point that there are some situations where immediate violent self-defense is not only justified, but morally necessary. And that a society that prevents parents from defending their children is a society with deeply disordered priorities. I would rather that the lady in Massachusetts last month who was taking her daughter to soccer, who was carjacked by a recidivistic maggot who'd been in the prison system all his life but was let out again because we feel sorry for him. Nent continued building his case with real examples rather than theoretical scenarios instead of her being hijacked and murdered. I'd rather she just shot the bastard dead. But in Massachusetts, somebody decided she can't do that, he said, his voice heavy with contempt for the politicians who created that situation. So she's dead. I would rather she was alive and the carjacker was dead. I'm weird. The sarcasm in that last word was devastating. Of course, he wasn't weird. He was expressing the common-sense view that innocent life is more valuable than criminal life. That people should be able to defend themselves. That a woman taking her daughter to soccer shouldn't have to die because politicians decided she shouldn't be trusted with a gun. What's weird, what's insane is a system that prioritizes the safety and comfort of violent criminals over the lives of their victims. There are judges out there across America who think it's safer to release these animals and criminals back into the street, Nent continued, identifying another piece of the puzzle. And by doing so, they are endangering law-abiding citizens. Their lives are in danger because some judge thinks he's doing the right thing morally. This was the perfect complement to Russell's arguments about deterrence. It's not just that gun control disarms victims. It's that our entire criminal justice system has become so focused on the rights of criminals and so dismissive of victims that violent predators are routinely released to victimize. Again, in this context, disarming citizens isn't just wrong, it's a death sentence for the innocent. Guy who beat this lady to within an inch of her life in Waco on parole, Nent said, citing another real case. Beat her to within an inch of her life in front of her grandchildren with a whiskey bottle. I would rather she fell to the ground, pulled out a .38 and shot him 6 times in the chest and killed him. Am I weird? Because the guy is going to get out again. Then came the line that perfectly encapsulated the entire argument. I don't like repeat offenders. I like dead offenders. It was harsh, uncompromising, politically incorrect, and absolutely morally justified. Why should a woman be beaten nearly to death in front of her grandchildren? Why should violent criminals get endless chances to victimize more people? Why should the law-abiding be defenseless while predators are coddled by a broken justice system? These weren't hypothetical scenarios or theoretical debates. These were real people who died because gun control advocates decided that their ideology was more important than innocent lives. Meanwhile, back on The View, the hosts continued to spout debunked talking points and emotional appeals, revealing just how disconnected they were from reality. Joy Behar's claim that she felt safer in the New York subway than in Arizona with armed citizens was perhaps the most absurd statement of the entire segment. A statement that revealed just how deeply the bubble of elite liberal coastal privilege insulates people from reality. The New York subway system, where people are regularly assaulted, where violent crime is rampant, where the very gun laws Behar supports, have created a situation where only criminals have guns and law-abiding citizens are defenseless. This was supposedly safer than Arizona, where violent crime rates are lower, and where armed citizens go about their business without incident day after day. It was the kind of statement that only makes sense if you've never actually thought about the issue, never looked at crime statistics, never considered that criminals don't follow gun laws, never acknowledged that the places with the strictest gun control often have the highest violent crime rates. Whoopi Goldberg's argument that police won't know who the bad guys are when citizens are armed was equally absurd. As if police officers, trained professionals, can't tell the difference between an active shooter murdering people and an armed citizen defending against that shooter. As if there haven't been numerous cases where armed citizens stopped active shooters and then immediately complied with police when they arrived with no confusion about who the good guys were. The argument revealed something deeper, though, a fundamental distrust of ordinary citizens, a belief that people can't be trusted to make good decisions, that only government agents should have access to force. It was authoritarian thinking dressed up as concern for public safety. Multiple studies have shown that armed citizens successfully defend themselves hundreds of thousands of times per year, often without even firing a shot. Just the presence of a gun is enough to deter criminals. But these stories don't fit the narrative that the mainstream media wants to promote, so they're ignored or downplayed. The truth is that more guns in the hands of law-abiding citizens leads to less crime, not more. States that passed shall issue concealed carry laws saw violent crime rates drop. Cities that banned guns saw violent crime rates soar. The experiment has been run. The data is in, and the results are clear. Gun control doesn't work. But facts don't matter to ideologues. Emotion matters. Virtue signaling matters. The appearance of doing something matters. Actually solving problems, that's secondary. What Kurt Russell did on The View that day resonated far beyond that single interview. He showed that it's possible to stand up to the gun control establishment, to defend constitutional rights without apology, to refuse to be bullied by media consensus or celebrity peer pressure. He showed that the arguments in favor of gun rights are actually stronger than the arguments against them if you're willing to articulate them clearly and defend them logically. He showed that emotional manipulation doesn't work against someone who understands history, human nature, and constitutional principles. Most importantly, he showed ordinary Americans that they're not alone, that their views on gun rights are shared by thoughtful, principled people. Even in Hollywood, in an industry where conservative views are often career-killing, Russell's willingness to speak truth made a difference. The fundamental message was simple but powerful. Free people have the right to defend themselves. Government has no legitimate authority to disarm law-abiding citizens. The Second Amendment exists precisely to prevent tyranny, whether from external enemies or from our own government. And anyone who would take away that right, regardless of their stated intentions, is moving society toward tyranny. Guns don't kill people, as the saying goes. And it's true, despite how often it's mocked. Guns are tools. Evil resides in human hearts, not in pieces of metal. A person determined to commit murder will find a way whether guns are available or not. But a person trying to defend themselves against that murderer needs the most effective tool available. And that tool is a gun. Every attempt to restrict gun rights, no matter how it's packaged, ultimately comes down to a simple question. Do you trust free people, or do you want government to control them? Do you believe in natural rights that pre-exist government, or do you believe that government grants rights and can take them away? Do you think people should be able to defend themselves, or should they be dependent on government agents who can't be everywhere at once? Russell came down firmly on the side of freedom, of natural rights, of self-reliance and personal responsibility. The hosts of The View came down on the side of government control, of collective dependency, of a paternal state that knows better than ordinary citizens what's good for them. The American people have consistently chosen Russell's side. Despite decades of propaganda from the media, despite celebrity activism and emotional appeals after every tragedy, despite a coordinated effort to reframe the debate and marginalize gun rights advocates, the American people continue to support the Second Amendment. They continue to buy guns in record numbers. They continue to get concealed carry permits. They continue to resist every attempt to disarm them because deep down most Americans understand what Kurt Russell articulated so clearly, that the right to defend yourself is fundamental, that criminals don't follow laws, that evil exists in the world and must be confronted, and that a disarmed population is a population ripe for tyranny. What started as an ambush on a daytime talk show became a masterclass in defending constitutional rights. What the hosts thought would be an easy opportunity to promote their gun control agenda became a devastating exposure of how weak their arguments are when challenged by clear thinking. Kurt Russell walked into that studio as a guest promoting a movie. He walked out as a champion of the Second Amendment, someone who had articulated truths that millions of Americans believe, but rarely hear expressed so clearly in mainstream media. The hosts of The View learned that day that not every celebrity will bow to their orthodoxy, that some people value truth and principle over popularity and approval, that there are still Americans willing to defend freedom regardless of the social cost. And viewers learned that the gun control arguments they hear constantly in the media aren't actually that strong, that they collapse when confronted with logic and historical understanding, that the people promoting them often don't know what they're talking about and are just repeating talking points they've never critically examined. Was Russell right to stand his ground so firmly? Did The View deserve to have their arguments dismantled so systematically? Should more celebrities follow his example and speak truth even when it's unpopular in their industry? The answer to all these questions is yes. Because the alternative, a culture where only one side of the debate is allowed to be heard, where constitutional rights are gradually eroded through emotional manipulation and propaganda, where ordinary Americans are disarmed and made dependent on government for their protection, is a culture moving inexorably toward tyranny. Kurt Russell understood this. He chose to stand for freedom. And in doing so, he reminded millions of Americans that they're not alone, that their beliefs are grounded in truth and history, and that it's still possible to defend liberty even in the face of overwhelming media hostility. That's why this moment mattered. That's why it resonated. And that's why the memory of Kurt Russell calmly systematically destroying gun control arguments on The View will endure long after the hosts and their weak talking points are forgotten.